You're listening to the We Are Libertarians podcast network. Find all of our shows at wearelibertarians.com. Welcome to the program. Thank you for joining us. My name is Chris Spangle. It is so great to be here with you. And today we are going to be talking a little bit about Taiwan and why is it important. Nancy Pelosi. I'd be really annoyed if Nancy Pelosi set off World War III, nor would I be very surprised. So she recently visited the island, and China immediately started shuffling troops and threatening to shoot down her plane. Oh no, stop, and all this other stuff. And so we want to figure out, why is this actually important? It seems like it caused a tremendous amount of tension between the American government and the Chinese government, specifically on the Chinese side. And to do that, we have Daniel Chang. He is a political science and economics student from the University of South Florida. He worked as a congressional intern to Rep. Gus Bilirakis in Florida. He is also the head of international analysis at Politiks. He's a Young Voices contributor. Daniel, how did you get into political commentating? When did you fall in love with politics? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, Chris, thank you. First, thank you very much for having me in your show. Very excited about it. And well, I've been in love with politics, I think, since I have years of memory. So while most of my friends, they tended to watch probably Disney Channel, I love to watch History Channel for a long before.
Oh, so welcome. You're in the right place. I instead of going to a movie, stayed in the car listening to the Clinton impeachment. So I was right there on C-SPAN with you.
Exactly. Although I think the Clinton impeachment was a little bit R-rated for you at the time.
Yeah, I know. I was 12, and believe me, I was like, "What does this cigar mean?"
Oh no. Well, so since then, I've been very interested in politics. I came to the United States to study in 2017. As you said, I'm a political scientist and an economist, and been working with Young Voices for a couple of years now, and it's been great actually. So always been interested in American politics, international politics, and British politics as well.
So you said you came to America. Where did you come from?
Venezuela.
Okay. All right. Yeah. All right. How are things there?
Well, the things are going as they're going. Not very good. Not very good. Let me tell you that.
Yeah. Well, maybe so let me ask you real quick before we dive into Taiwan, because you just threw me a curveball there. Maybe we can have you back and talk about that in a broader spectrum. But last we heard, there was a coup, and the Maduro was term limited out, and so your Congress was taking over. And have things calmed down from hyperinflation? What is the situation on the ground in Venezuela these days?
So situation on the ground, I haven't been in my country since 2018, so 4 years now. So of course, what I know because of my friends and the few people who still live in there, because a lot of people have left the country. I think 10%, maybe more, over the last 3 years. But the situation is that Maduro regretfully has, he has consolidated his grip in power. As you said, the attempt of the opposition to, jug him out of office because he won in a really fraudulent election, didn't work out, didn't pan out. The sanctions of the United States, if you ask me, that's another can of worms, but they haven't worked in one way or another. And Maduro has consolidated his grip in power and has made alliances with other sanctioned countries like Iran and Russia and China and whatnot. And he's been able to linger on in power, really.
Well, that's too bad. Yeah. Your country deserves better. I hear it's a beautiful country, and that's fascinating. So next time Venezuela's in the news, I will be sure to email you. But right now we're talking about Taiwan.
Let's talk about something less depressing. Let's talk about World War III, right?
Yes, right. Let's something that doesn't personally impact our friends and family. Oh,
exactly.
Where is Taiwan, and why does anybody care about this small island?
Yeah.
Let's just start with the real basic stuff here.
Yeah. So Taiwan is an island that is really next by China. It's across the Taiwan Straits. And that it's an island that has been administered basically independently from Beijing since the end of the Chinese Civil War in 1948. Basically, the communists won, but the nationalists were the anti-communist side. They lost and they retreated to Taiwan, and they've been governing that island ever since. For the first, I would say 30 years, they actually thought that they were gonna to reinvade China and conquer it. That they didn't work out. And ever since they've been governing themselves. And since the 1990s, Taiwan is a democracy. It's a presidential democracy. And, there's always been these tensions between Taiwan and China, because China says that Taiwan it's a part of China, and that the annexation, and why either peaceful or non-peaceful, of the island, it's a cardinal goal. It's a really important goal for the Chinese Communist Party, ever since the war ended. Actually, they didn't invade at first because the U.S. supported the Taiwanese government. That's why they didn't invade at first. That's like,
if I remember correctly, at the beginning of Mao, at the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, the wealthiest people in China fled to Taiwan, which is why it's so prosperous, which is why China wants its hands, sort of like Hong Kong. We've seen what's happened in Hong Kong over the last decade as they've choked the freedom out of it.
Yeah, it's a similar, a little bit different story than Hong Kong, but it's like similar principles. Maybe it's different. So China says it's theirs, but it has been ruled by, in the case of Hong Kong, they were ruled by the British and then by themselves for a while. And Taiwan, they've been ruled by themselves for, I want to 70 years more. And yes, they've been quite a prosperous country. They have adopted free markets, they adopted a democracy and all that. And China has always, wanted to take it. But it's not only because they wanted to take it because of the resources, although we can delve into that because of the chips, semiconductors, and all that. But it's also because a really important geopolitical location. Taiwan is in the middle of what U.S. policy says is the first island chain. So you divide the Pacific basically on 3, but mainly 2 island chains, which is a set of islands, which are important to control in order to have to keep China at bay, to really control the Pacific. And Taiwan isn't. It's really difficult to say without a map, but basically Taiwan is in the middle of that first island chain. And if Taiwan falls to the Chinese Communist Party and to China, of course, they will have a very, very powerful position to expand their influence throughout the region, throughout the Pacific, throughout the South China Sea, and it will be like an unsinkable aircraft carrier for the Chinese government. So that's also like the geopolitical part of it.
Yeah, almost like Ukraine, where we're talking about sphere of influences. Tell me if I have this correct. Ukraine is sort of in between the Western sphere of influence and NATO and Russia's sphere of influence. Pretty clearly, the majority of the country seems to not want to be part of Russia, or else they wouldn't be fighting so hard. It goes back to the Monroe Doctrine and how we fought to keep Cuba and Puerto Rico and other places kind of, in the American sphere of influence. The Chinese essentially don't want America or other countries to have the ability to reach them from air bases there, and they want to control that space. Do I have that correct? That this is really about that zone of influences that first world countries kind of can protect themselves?
Yeah, partly is of that, like his first of influence, but it's also part of like a national mythos that the Chinese Communist Party has been telling themselves for the last 70 years. So if you check Chinese history, you've had times of unification and then disintegration. That's like a trope in Chinese history. And the last time that China disintegrated was one they called the Century of Humiliation, after the British defeated them during the 2 opium wars, when they took Hong Kong and all that. Basically, China disintegrated as a functioning state, and it was a really proud nation. And they got, really they were the punching bag of many Western countries, and that created a sense of historical injustice, which is really, well, you can see that with Putin as well. And retaking Hong Kong, Taiwan, and they eventually did that with Tibet and other regions, is part of what the Chinese Communist Party says. Well, this is the end of that. We are reivindicating ourselves from that century of humiliation by foreign powers, and taking Taiwan back is like basically the jewel in that crown. So it has geopolitical influence, and it has geopolitical interest, because if you have Taiwan, you can have an influence in the South China Sea and all that region. But it's also have a really ideological kind of meaning, and like that kind of historical sense for the CCP, which is important for Xi Jinping as well.
So what about semiconductors? Because I read on Facebook from all the experts on my feed that we only care about it because of semiconductors being made there. What can you fill us in on that?
Well, basically, Taiwan is the prime location foundry is it, for semiconductors, which are chips that we use for basically everything. From like, of course, laptops, computers, smartphones, to like cars, and a lot of our processing and a lot of what we need to live in the 21st century comes from semiconductors, and the majority of them are made in Taiwan. So that's a really geopolitical importance, not only for the United States, but like again for the world, because keeping the semiconductors flowing through the global economy is really important to keep everything going on, the lights on. And in fact, as you said, the United States just passed the CHIPS Act and all that. In part, is to create more semiconductors in the United States. We all this issue about bringing global supply chains back to prevent disruption. So that's the part of the semiconductor, the economic part of it, that Taiwan it's important. But I would say it's not only because of that. Honestly, semiconductors are really important, but Taiwan, their unique position in where they are, the unique geopolitical position, and the fact that China and the United States will be adversaries for the time being, and it's kind of inevitable that they're adversaries, will mean that Taiwan is always going to be a hot spot between both of them.
Why do you think it's inevitable?
Well, because it's the tell us all the time. You have two powers. You have a rising power, and you have a hegemon or a former hegemon, and it's as simple as one country. In order for one power to actually prevail and be the global power, or at least the regional power in the case of China, they will have to take away the interest and fight the interest of the other power. It's the my Greek is really bad.
Thucydides trap.
Yeah,
Graham Allison wrote a book about it.
So it's really like it tells us all the time. In my case, I tend to be more like in the realist side of international relations than like in the liberal side. But the fact is that China and the United States, in order to China to become the country that they want, that Xi Jinping says they want to become, and become the regional leader, they will have to take away from U.S. allies in the region. The U.S. will not be really comfortable with that one.
So we care because, I guess it feeds into a larger question, right? Pax Americana, so-called. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the American government ensures stability throughout the entire world by having bases in 160 some countries, and that's why we haven't had any major wars despite all the wars going on. Is that why we care about Taiwan, or is there another reason that the American government specifically cares about Taiwan, and why have they supported them through these years?
Well, that's a question that I talked to in my article. It's that this level of support for the United States to Taiwan, it has been since the 1970s. It's in a weird place. So that's
sort of dichotomous. It doesn't make any sense because, I guess, explain the one China policy, because that sort of opens up the thesis of your article, which is we're not doing anything that makes sense. There's no moral clarity whatsoever. Yeah. That's, if you read Gary Kasparov about Ukraine and winter is coming, he talks about the same thing. There's no moral clarity to American foreign policy. It's very confused. The left hand and the right hand don't know what's happening. And this is a great example that you've hit on. So please explain that more.
Yeah, I want to say not moral clarity. There's no strategic clarity at all. I mean, that's just they're trying to do whatever, trying to throw everything on the wall, see what sticks. So what happens is you have the one China policy. As I told you, when the nationalists lost this civil war, they went to Taiwan. They didn't declare independence, which is a really important thing. What they did is that they said they were the legitimate government of China, just like in exile kind of thing. But they said we'll be back, right? That's what was the main thesis. And the United States recognized the Taiwan government as the China government for like 30 years. But when Nixon restarted relations with the communist China in the 1970s, they eventually became to the one China policy, which is saying the United States said, okay, we recognize only one legitimate government of China, which is, well, in this case, of course, Beijing, and we will not recognize implicitly. That the implicit thing of that is that they will not recognize like Taiwanese independence or the Taiwanese claim of they are the legitimate government of China. However, that one China policy was paired with what we call strategic ambiguity, meaning that while we recognize that Beijing is the only China, we keep like de facto relationships with Taiwan, which is in all intents and purposes an independent country, just they haven't declared it yet. So we keep that like weird, the United States keep that weird game saying we only recognize one government in China, but we have relationship with both governments.
Yeah, you saw it from the Biden administration. You have the Democratic Speaker of the House going and standing next to the head of Taiwan, while the press secretary for the president, the Democratic president, is saying we disavow this. Like, you have to imagine Joe Biden was just furious because he's having to undermine the Speaker of the House. It didn't make any sense because on the one hand, one part of the government in the same party is saying one thing, and then the other is saying the other thing. And I think it's the perfect illustration of what you're talking about.
Yeah, and that's also part of it. Well, we have reports of like Biden wanted Pelosi not to go to the trip, and that's also one of the issues with American foreign policy over the last decades, in the sense that it's very inconsistent. You have various parts within the government that have different foreign policy agendas, and of course, you have to change the government every 4 or 8 years. That basically the whole agenda is to undo what the past administration did, and that creates some like really convoluted and disjointed foreign policy efforts.
Yeah, I think from an international relations perspective, maybe you can explain this. And it's the American foreign policy is just whipsaw. There's no consistent foreign policy. What does that do for America, and what does that do for the world, and what would you prefer to see?
Well, what it does for America is that it diminishes its bargaining power, really, because when America makes a commitment, the other actors, they do know that commitment probably will not last for the next president. And what the other actors say is like, well, America is not really a reliable actor, right? If we need to guarantee a negotiation, a treaty, or whatever for a long period of time, America is not the best. Is the best actor to do so. That's what our allies would say. But of course, the adversaries of America would say, well, you know what? I can just wait it out, right? I don't care if America says something. I know that the Biden will probably lose 2024 if he runs or not, and the Republican president will try to basically undo everything that the Biden did, and vice versa. So they just wait it out, and that and every time that America changes its foreign policy, it's a lag. There's a period where decision makers are trying to figure out what's the new strategy, and during that time, of course, adversaries grow stronger because they don't change that policy. They have the same one for the last 5-10 years. So of course, what America needs is it's understandable because part of democracy that you change a policy, right? That's why we have a democratic process. But in foreign policy, you need to at least keep the most important pillars of foreign policy need to survive the peaceful transition of power, because if not, then it's not a policy, right? It's just a whim, right? It's just talking points. It's governing by talking points instead of governing by governing.
Yeah, no, I think we all feel that on the state side version of it, right? Like Biden comes in and undoes all these executive orders. There's nothing passed by Congress. There's no treaties ratified by the Senate or anything. So it's the same concept. The system is fundamentally broken from where it was. So let's put you in charge. We changed the Constitution. Daniel Chang is elected president. What foreign policy towards Taiwan do you set, or do you think we ought to follow, and why?
Well, what I would think is the United States needs to make it clear that China cannot, and make it really clear China cannot try to invade Taiwan. And for that, we need to make deterrence a viable option. The problem with Ukraine is there was no deterrence at all. We kept Ukraine in a weird place. There was neither NATO nor not NATO. So, Russia said we can't invade, and probably the West will do nothing. And that's one of the reasons they invaded. What we need to do with Taiwan is making clear that strategic ambiguity worked for like 2 decades, maybe. But we're not in the 1980s anymore. We're into 2022, and China has the ability to contest American power at sea. So we need to make quite clear that although we will not recognize, the United States will not recognize the jure independence of Taiwan, the United States is committed to prevent any cross-strait attack right, from either side. Of course, Taiwan's not going to attack China, but we'll say, well, we're there to prevent any war between China and Taiwan. We keep the one China policy. Taiwan's not declaring independence. I don't care about that. What I care is that there will be no cross-strait invasion, because it will bring mayhem to the global economy and to the region and all that. That's what I would do.
Sounds reasonable to me, but you and I know I'm not going to be put in charge. I hope you are. All right. Shameless self-promotion time. Where can people follow you? I'll have the link to the article in the show notes, but if people want to follow your work, where can they do that at?
Of course, you can follow me. You can follow me on Twitter. My handles over there is Daniel E. Chang C. I work at El American also as well. So I make some op-eds over there, and I publish all my work in my Twitter account. So if you guys follow me and read all the things that I do, it will be very nice.
All right, Daniel Chang, Young Voices contributor, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, listener, for being here, and we will see you again soon.